London. What a splendid place. If you want to tweet along, I don't know if there's a hashtag for this event, for those of you who aren't into Twitter, but you should be, actually, particularly as you're all switched-on sort of people. And Forbes have done a study that shows that chief executives who tweet, apparently their companies outperform those who don't. So I don't know what we found that. Anyway, if you want to tweet, there's my Twitter address. But if you get in touch, I'm sure the slides will be on a website. And, of course, there are too many, but they're just there to remind me what to say next. I mean, and it's been fantastic, hasn't it? I'm a sort of fairly grumpy person, and I got a daily email telling me how London was going to be in chaos over the summer, and I should probably give up all hope and leave immediately. And Boris, every time I got out of the tube, told me the big one was coming and I should run away. But actually, it was splendid, and I knew it was going to be great just on the opening ceremony. We have offices in about 85 countries, and as soon as I started getting texts from Brazil saying, you have the Queen and Bond, and, you know, so just oh, this is great. Anyway, so it's been fantastic, I think, this year. I think many of us are sort of perhaps, some of you, of course, knew it was going to be great because you organised it. But for many of us, we were pleasantly surprised how wonderful it was. And what we found when we looked at the attitudes of the British public, do you think that the Olympics had a good effect on the mood of the public before the Olympics and after the Olympics? 86% said it made them feel more cheerful. Has it made us more popular with the rest of the world? 63% thought it would. 78% say it has. And actually, the data that we're just getting in from our study we do in 27 countries around the world does seem to imply that there certainly is an Olympics bounce, and it has helped some people perhaps revalue their views about London. It certainly surprised many of them. And generally, what we find is when we ask people all over the world, what we think about Britain as a place to invest, and this is asking people in Hungary at the top, the South Africans, the Mexicans, the Indonesians, the Brazilians, is Britain a good place to put money into? You can see that most countries are actually much more positive about putting money here than we are ourselves. In Britain, only 24% say it is, and 32% say it isn't. Now, the Japs and the French and the Belgians don't seem to think we're a good place to put money, but the rest of the world is pretty cheerful about us. The Russians, the Chinese, the Argentinians, the Turks. Britain's a good place to invest. And we sometimes, we did a big study looking at Britishness before the Olympics, and it is true that we are a bit dour sometimes. Anyway. Business generally positive about London as a great place to be. 8 out of 10 saying they can see a benefit for London from it. Lots of people saying that they're going to see, the potential of the legacy. Most people confident about economic growth in London. All of the indicators that I can find, lots and lots of good news. And if you live in London, you won't necessarily get this if you look just at the local media, or indeed always talk to people about London as a whole. But Londoners report feeling safer where they live than ever before. I won't go on about that, but on many, many indicators, things are getting better. If you look at the international rankings of cities, and there are lots of different ways of doing it, of course, and some, we have to look at how many are compiled by people in London as opposed to other places. But nevertheless, on 7 of the 12, London is the top-rated city, ahead of Paris, Frankfurt, or anywhere else in Europe. So again, good news all round. And, when we look at the sorts of things people were saying, it'll be a great place to do business with regulatory certainty and consistency. And regulatory certainty and consistency, I think, is something that Britons as a whole probably underplay or don't value. Why do the Russians want to come here and do their lawsuits here? We invented many of the professions in this world, and Britain, that's one of Britain's intangible soft power assets, and it's certainly one of London's assets. Fundamental attractiveness that very few countries match: the English language, the time zone, the infrastructure. We can act as a template for other markets. The UK still has the most respected rule of law and regulation around the world. London can still establish itself as a role model for the rest of the world, says somebody in Hong Kong. So really interesting to see how others see us. We sometimes are too tough on ourselves. I mean, when we ask the British, what's the best thing about Britain? You know what we say? Heritage and the NHS. Business is absolutely at the bottom of British people's lists of what's great about this country. And, I think we undervalue that. I think the CBI is doing some work on that. We need to. It's interesting I think that's important. This is a very busy chart, which simply shows in the red line trends from GLA about
how overall employment in London will rise. But of course, interesting, and you can't see it mostly on this chart because of the scale, but down on the bottom, financial services pretty flat, but a rise in business services. And we'll need to think about what sort of employment mix we're actually going to have in this great city. When we ask Londoners what's great about the place, this is not a chart I would have been able to show you earlier this century. I mean, what is astonishing about this chart is the bar at the top. The top thing people living in London now say is the best thing about the city, unprompted, is the transport. And in 2003, it was way down the chart. That number was 23% in 2003 when we first did that study. So, you know, a massive shift and recognition of the investment that's gone in. We can all argue about wanting more, but that is a complete sea change in terms of how people actually living in the city talk about it. And generally, you know, pretty good about London as a place to live. 82% saying it's a good place to live. Is it getting better? Well, of course, most things in Britain always get worse. If you ask the British, you know, how is the education of children these days? Oh, it's much worse than it used to be. How do young people behave these days? Oh, much worse than it used to be. But nevertheless, reasonably cheerful. A bit of anxiety about the future, but to be honest, one of the most, you know, compelling things about virtually anybody anywhere in Europe at the moment is that we don't know much about the future. One issue about London, though, that's interesting is this is a study that looks at how happy you are with your life. This is actually paid for by David Cameron, who believes that looking at well-being is as important as looking at how much money you have. Now, he hasn't talked about this quite as much as he used to about 5 or 6 years ago, but he has spent, in an age of austerity, millions of pounds of your money, I don't do this one, but I love the data, on finding out how happy people are. So on this chart, what you can see on the vertical axis is your happiness score. So you can see that the very happiest places are Bath and North East, Somerset and Rutland. The most miserable place to be on a sort of regular basis is the West Midlands. The most miserable on any one day, when you ask people, by the way, were you happy yesterday, is Blackpool, so do not go there. But London is here, so, you know, we're a bit below the line. It's not a perfect correlation, but we're perhaps a bit grumpier than our levels of income would suggest. So for roughly the same level of income, if you want to be happy, move to Rutland. It would appear that you would be a bit happier than if you lived in either in or out of London. And, you know, obviously some challenges in terms of what's going to happen. These are projections of population, which does suggest that we are going to go on being a key global city, and we're going to have more and more people that we need to process through. And it's on the way here, coming just at one particular tube interchange from the Overground into the Jubilee line. It was clear that we hadn't quite worked out how popular the Overground was going to be at about 6:45 in the morning, as there were sort of massive queues as people trying to get in. And if all those people are going to come on the tube with me as well, I can see some challenges. Now, the good thing about this is that most predictions are actually wrong. And actually, I know everybody in this room is very learned, obviously, including myself, but the American academics generally believe that experts are only about 5% better than the general public at actually guessing what's going to happen. This is, in the red bars, if you can read it here, what oil experts predicted would happen to the price of oil. In the white line is what actually happened. The red dotted lines show you what they predicted in 1981, what they predicted in 1984, what they predicted in 1987, 1990, and 1993. And as you can see, they're wrong all the time. Now, this is interesting, isn't it? It's difficult to know exactly what's going to happen. I think I'll make this prediction now. I won't be around to tell you whether it's true or not, but it's almost certainly going to be true. Because of the 100 largest organisations in the world, in 1912, only one is still in existence. And they had lots of experts too. This is the fossil record. This looks at how often animals became extinct. And the frequency chart looks at the percentage of animals becoming extinct per million years. And what's interesting is if you look at that chart, we'll then think about those 100 largest companies in the world in 1912, and we'll look at when they went bust. Now, what does this tell us? I think it tells us that however brilliant you are, shit happens. But what we... and we should all, in our personal and professional lives, console ourselves about this. But I think it does mean that when we're planning the future, we need to be as adaptive and as flexible as possible. Now, if we think about London, one of the things, and we've already heard from the previous speaker about how important immigration is to London, and Londoners are different, well, as we know, in all sorts of ways, to the rest of the country. But when it comes to those numbers, we are more likely to say that the number of migrants coming in should stay the same, nearly twice as likely as the rest of the country, 33% compared to only 15% in, say, the West Midlands or 14% of the East Midlands. We've still got a third of Londoners who want it to be reduced a lot, but we're much more sympathetic to immigration. Now, some of that is because actually people who live in London, and this includes, and white Londoners, I'm just looking around the room because there's a lot of white Londoners here. Many of us, of course, moved to London because we wanted to live in an exciting international city and not live in, well, in my case, mid-Devon or in, North Wales or anywhere else. So that is interesting. And on property, I think some interesting issues about how Londoners feel about the way the city's going to have to change to cope with that rise in population, assuming that the experts are correct in their projections. Most people will happily agree with the proposition that there is a housing crisis in Britain. We can find only one person in 100 to strongly disagree with that idea, but 35 times more will strongly agree. So there's definitely a housing crisis. There's a belief that we should build some more housing. It doesn't matter who you ask, the CBI, a professor of innovation, this whole issue about what infrastructure, what housing, what development we will need. And that view is that we need to do something. The challenge, of course, when you start to build is where and how and who's going to encourage you. Londoners disagree that there's enough housing in London for people to live in decent homes they can afford. They disagree that housing will become more affordable over the next 2 years or so, and I think most evidence would be they're probably right. And I think perhaps most depressingly, and there is this huge issue that the city contains, as does much of the rest of Britain, of intergenerational inequity. Many of us sitting in our houses that we own, but our poor kids, I don't know, the only way my son is going to get a house, unless his career turns out to be the way it wants it to be, which I think is unlikely, is going to, don't tell him, he wants to be a super fashion designer, so you can say. But 61% expecting they're never going to be able to get a house. And most people, whatever tenure they are in, even if they're social renters, want ultimately, if they could, to own their own property. We still dream of being a property-owning democracy. So what's important? And when you ask, experts what they think are going to be the most important things in terms of helping the UK economy to grow, interestingly, we all seize on manufacturing. But interestingly, construction and retail right in there as key issues. So people recognise that well ahead of things like financial services generally, or transport and distribution. So lots of expectation that we need it, but challenges about where it might be. People think the country is full. We ask people, do you believe that, how much of England is developed land? So 9% think three-quarters of Britain is already fully developed. 16% between half and three quarters, 18% around half. And of course, the actual figure is about 10%, according to the Office of National Statistics. So we have this general view that, development's out of control. And yet some of the most densely populated places in London, of course, are also those with the greatest levels of satisfaction of quality of life, and indeed sort of happiness with local services. So some real challenges. Do you think there's already enough development here? We think there's a housing crisis, but 49% think in their neighbourhood there's already plenty of development. We can find only 7% who would strongly disagree. When we look at why people say things haven't happened, why haven't you built things in your, and talk to local authorities about that? The main reason is basically, it's not that the developers don't have enough money, although they say that might be an issue. It's not that they can't get the infrastructure, although that is part of the issue. But number one, by some mile, is actually, ne passeran, we are full up. And I've sat in innumerable focus groups over the last 25 years that I've done this job, and I've sort of sat with people and talked about planning and development, and people sort of drawing maps around Essex, saying, Essex is good, but nobody is to cross this line and come into Essex, thank you very much. So some real challenges, I think, in terms of how we take people there. And it doesn't really matter what you're looking at. Airport capacity. Have we got enough? Londoners, 45% say it should be, 46% say it shouldn't. To me, actually, this chart gives absolute carte blanche permission to the government, Boris Johnson, or virtually anybody else, to just go and build another airport immediately. Because if you ask them about the congestion charge in 2000, 56% opposed to it. And as it came closer and closer, opposition actually grew. And then Ken Livingstone stands for re-election. The congestion charge goes in. Turns out not to be Armageddon. 55% of Londoners in 2004 gave Ken Livingstone their first or second preference votes after he introduced a policy that had a higher level of opposition than that does. So I think latent permission is probably there, although I'm glad I'm not a politician. And generally, the key issue that we need to, and undoubtedly you will have a conversation about today, is really around can we get the infrastructure there? That has been the great concern when people like in the past, John Prescott would sort of mutter about 200,000 homes in the Thames Gateway or something. Locals would be muttering back, well, this is great, but how on earth are we going to, where are the doctors' surgeries, where are the schools, where are the roads? In all of those studies that we've been looking at in this particular study, this is down actually in Canterbury, but as just a classic example, 9 out of 10 people wanting to see that infrastructure is coming and to be clear about that before the development. Although it's fair to say that although NIMBYism is alive and well in Britain, actually Londoners, in some ways, and of course new homes in your community mean all sorts of things. It's when they start to obscure your view, or that, Nick Bowles changes the planning laws so that you can have a huge extension on the roof or something like that, which I'm quite keen on in my house in Maida Vale. But overall, then, Londoners appear to have a lower level of opposition. It's not that they're massively more enthusiastic than many other parts of the country. And obviously we have a presumption now in favour of sustainable development. I think an interesting question here is, what does that really mean? We can get people to agree with the proposition that I would support new development if it helped to create jobs by attracting people and businesses. So you definitely want to stress that one. And one thing that we absolutely know in terms of how one is negotiating or talking to local communities is that often we have seen in the past people's opposition to new development in an area, or particularly in sort of suburban areas. And then you add 4 words to the statement. Are you in favour of new housing and development so young people stay? The opposition goes from 30% in favour to 60% in favour, because of course people are facing this slow crisis of the young not being able to get their own house, and also often in many cases hanging around at home longer than ever. This I think shows it fairly clearly. I would support new development if it meant more affordable, that enough affordable homes are provided for local residents. Now, the challenge about who is a local resident is a real issue. People don't like local residents coming if they turn out to be on the social housing list and they're not exactly their neighbours. I mean, we've seen this so often in the counties. But nevertheless, these are some of the propositions that might tend to make people more enthusiastic. And people concerned about, whether London can cope. There are plenty of opportunities in London for the current population. 68% disagree. You may have a different view, but that's their view in London. The state of the job market in London will improve. A quarter say yes, but 57% say no. So, making the link that this has to happen for your kids, for their future, is really, really important. Because if we talk about sustainability at the moment in Britain and in America, for the first time ever, what we're seeing is more people expecting their kids, many more people expecting their kids to be worse off than they have in the future. It was 12% in the grey there who said in 2003 that their children would be worse off than they are. That has now risen in 2011 to 35%. And it's when it gets personal that people will often say that the economy is going to hell in a handcart. They nearly always do, to be honest, in Britain. But what's interesting is 3 times more people now expecting their own children to be worse off than they are. And I think that is a challenge. And if development and sustainable development is part of the solution, that will be very, very important. But, people, we do need to look at quality. Generally, people saying that actually what has gone in, well, they're very, very divided about it, to be honest. We know that they learn to love some things like the Eiffel Tower or the London Eye, not always delightful when they first go up, but then about 100 years later, you try taking them down, and there'll be sort of major, major problems. But overall, a third saying they disagree that actually it's making things, only most will, 35% will agree that it's making things worse rather than better. So if you are talking about development, and we need to persuade Londoners that population increase is happening. We are going to have to house people. We are going to have to give them jobs. We are going to have to help them move around. Then we need to address the issues on the left there. These are the things that time and time again previous governments failed to persuade the people in and around London that we're going to be all right. Those would be the issues. And some of the stuff that you use when you talk to the public, or even pretend to, density, mixed use, what are you on about? So they want to know that, there will be the road system will work. We've thought about that. We've thought about making sure there is housing for you, all of those types of issues. So I'll sum up and say, things are great. On many indicators, London is better than ever. We have a brilliant legacy in terms of a feel-good factor from the Olympics and infrastructure, but we're clearly going to face some peak load point in the future, which we are going to have to address. We need to make the case for more infrastructure, and many of you, of course, spend all your time lobbying for it, but the evidence is there. I think if we're talking about volume, we do need to talk about placemaking and quality. People are much more likely to accept it if they can believe that it's going to improve their quality of life. As an opinion pollster, I'd say, too often developers don't, read public opinion carefully enough or manage it carefully enough. And particularly, the government seems to row back from localism or be rather schizophrenic about it. But if we are believing in that, then we need to think about it. And it does actually ultimately save a lot of time and hassle, quite frankly. So what I want to do now is just try you out on some questions. On your tables, you will find some little, I've got two actually, I can vote twice, so that's good. You'll find some turning point keypads, which we're now going to vote on. So if we can call up the questions, please. I'm just going to do a test question to start with. And this is actually for my own purposes. I'd like to get a group of professionals in the room and then do a bit of impromptu opinion polling. So I'd like you to honestly tell me, and it's an anonymous survey, I don't know who's got which controller, how happy you are with your life overall, please. I know what the answer ought to be for people like you, so it's going to be very interesting. So if you're very happy with your life overall, you think it really couldn't be better, click A, which is in the top left. If you're fairly happy with your life, it could be a little bit better, click B. If you're not very happy with your life, because you're listening to terrible presentations like this, click C. And if you're not at all happy with everything, click D. Please vote now. Look at that. Where are you, those poor 2%? Okay, so God, that's an amazing score. You are blessed. You are truly blessed. Much happier than the average person in the UK. So I'm sure today is going to be wonderful. Right. Let's now try a serious question. Which single, I'm afraid we can only let you choose one option with this technology, which is the single biggest factor which makes London one of the most attractive places in the world? It says in which to business in. I think it means in which to do business in. So is it being a great financial and professional centre? Is it the history and culture on offer? Is it being able to get global talent here fairly easily, as long as the immigration minister lets them? Is it being a central location to access world-class academics like Tony Travers? Is it the leisure and entertainment that we can all find a few stones throw from this hotel? Is it the fact that actually, although we don't like our politicians, they are mostly pretty honest, actually. I mean, don't tell anybody I said that, but they are. Or is it just the great diversity and mixture of people, the fact that this is one of the world's greatest and most diverse cities? Please vote now. And you can answer this on a personal or professional basis, up to you. Okay, so financial and professional services, but also political stability, and then we have a mixture of everything else. Okay, we don't care about world-class academics in the property sector. Right. Sorry. Okay, well, we were making you choose only one. I know if I'd given you more than one, I know that would have been much higher. Right, let's try the next question, please. Okay, so what's the biggest threat to maintaining London as a world-class city? Is it airport capacity? Is it actually the cost of living, the levels of taxation, 45% if you're earning over 150k, or is it 50%? All of that. Is it the caps that stop you bringing people in? I remember we've got 1,300 people in London, and we are very, very diverse. And at one point, I think Border Control told us that I was allowed one person a year to transfer between Britain and somewhere else in the world, and I was sort of, killing myself. Road and rail capacity, is that going to be the challenge, getting those 9 million people around? Is it the nightmare of dealing with various people in terms of getting anything built, a planning application development? Or is it just that actually, ultimately, we aren't Silicon Valley, we don't really do technological innovation? Which one of those would you like to focus on as the key threat? Please vote now. Okay. So we have airports and the cost of living, taxation and the cost of the welfare state. Immigration, not really coming in there. Road and rail then just a bit behind airports. Not really worried about innovation. Okay, we're quite innovative. Let's try another one, please. Which part of London is going to see the greatest level of economic growth? So here are the experts. I can now test you and come back in 2020 and see what happens. So which bit is going to grow most? Is it the north, the south, East London, West London, or the West End and the city? The central activities zone. Please vote now. Okay. So that's a fairly clear answer. Move your money east. Okay. All right. And what's wrong with North London? Is it? It's full. Okay. All right. Ah, North London is full. Okay. All right. Okay. Ah, are you from Barnet? No. Okay. All right. Right. Next slide, please. Okay. So. If you want to get inward investment, if you want people, the Chinese, or anybody who's got money to come and spend it here and invest it here, which of these should we get right or really think about? The financial regulatory regime, and should we, do we have to keep persecuting the banks or lay on more regulation, or have we got too much? Is it airport capacity? Is it the overall public transport network? Is it our ability to respond to innovation and change, like green enterprise, the TMT sector, smart cities? Is it planning permission to get major things built? Is it just bringing in the talent? Which of those would be the single issue to get right? And you can also vote G if you think it's something else entirely. Well, I'm not sure what that would be. Right, please vote now. Oh, okay. Stable financial regime. Okay, thank you. I think that's pretty much it, really, on that one. Not much else to say. Absolutely. Okay, next. Right, we're talking about housing delivery. That's a nice jargon word, isn't it? Housing delivery. What needs to happen if we do want to get more decent homes for all of those people that are going to be here, rather than them building sheds in gardens or sleeping 5 to a room? So do we want to just release more public sector land and assets? Do we want to see the public sector jointly investing with the private sector in housing? Do we want to look at people's planning obligations, including the community infrastructure levy, to see if those are working as they should? Do we want the mayor and the boroughs to lead on housing delivery by setting up a public sector housing company? Please vote now. Okay, so we want the public sector to invest, because they've got a bit short of cash, but maybe they can find some somewhere or borrow it cheaply. And then a spread of the other answers. We're not so keen on... Is anybody who voted other? What was your other, Giles? Mortgages. What would you like? Cheaper mortgages or bigger mortgages? Just mortgages, okay. All right. Okay, and last one, please. Okay, in order to maintain our competitiveness, which is the tenure that we ought to think about over the next 8 years up to 2020? Is it the private rented sector? A? Is it C, affordable housing? Is it B, intermediate housing, e.g. things like shared equity, shared ownership? Is it market housing to buy? Or is it for our ageing population, maybe we'll try and keep some more of our older people in London rather than shipping them out, assisted living? Please vote now. Okay, so we want the private rented and intermediate sectors. We're less interested in market housing to buy. Interesting. Okay, and we're not too interested in care homes. Thank you very much for putting up with me. I'm going to go. I might see you later. Thank you.